Thanks very much for having me. In the few minutes before lunch, I'm going to unpack a really exciting topic for you, data. Probably something you haven't talked about today. But before you roll your eyes, I want to unpack a little bit about how we are using data to solve some really massive challenges. Social well-being, quality of life. I think when we talk about data, we're often thinking of that in the context of how do we make places more efficient, how do we make processes better, but it all fundamentally comes back to this question of why. Why are we collecting this information and what can it be used for? Now, I work in the property sector, we work with governments and property developers, and in that question, there's always this tension about what kind of information are we collecting. If you think of a place in your neighbourhood that you like to spend time, I wonder what that would be. Whether it's your favourite cafe, a park where you walk your dog, perhaps a beach. The places that we love and feel connected to have these distinctive personalities. They're memorable. I'm wondering if anyone imagined this. When we focus on buildings and infrastructure without people and culture, we come up with imaginations of the future that look a little bit like this, which could be fantastic, except that it overlooks one critical factor: humans. I imagine that places that came to mind looked a little bit more like this: human scale, smaller scale, social and cultural life. And it's this information about the social and cultural life of places which fundamentally drives the decisions that we make about cities. Now, I'm an urban designer. That means I've been spending my life designing places that some of them you would know, like the MCG. I didn't design it, but I did work on. Next time you go there, have a look at the width between the concrete gaps there. That was like 3 years of my life, working out what colour we were going to put between the aggregate. Someone needs to make that decision. But I think what architects and urban designers are really good at is imagining a future that's really people-centric. We imagine these places where people live and flourish and thrive. Only the challenge is you don't have to look very far to see that a lot of the city that we are creating doesn't look like that. Now, how is it with that much money and time invested in decisions about property that we fail so often? And it comes back to the same question as earlier, is that the best places, the places that are magnetic, that generate the best revenue, that have the highest values, are places for people. But you can't design places for people without any data about the people. It's kind of like doing a transport plan without any traffic data. It's something that you'd never consider doing. And while this, might on one hand lead to places where there are vacant retail or dying main streets, or perhaps neighbourhoods that aren't as vibrant and active as they could be, on a broader societal level, this is actually having a fundamental impact on well-being. That actually 80% of the drivers of your well-being are to do with where you live, not your primary health. And recent research from US has now shown that your postcode is as likely to affect your life expectancy as your genetics. The neighbourhood that you live in can fundamentally influence your life. Has anyone been to Glasgow? A few people? It's taken me my whole life to go there, but I went there last year. Really, really interesting place that is actually now making social well-being one of their major policy drivers for cities. But the reason is, if you live in the north of Glasgow or in the south, your life expectancy discrepancy is about 7 years. It's pretty extraordinary. So at Neighbourlytics, we turn that on its head. And what we really advocate for is that social prosperity should be seen as the framework that we use for city strategy and investment. Now, what does that mean? Well, we've looked at 96 different frameworks for social well-being around the world and looked at a best-of-breed approach. And great neighbourhoods essentially have three things. They have thriving and resilient local economies. They have great public spaces and opportunities to connect with nature, transport, and other basic infrastructure. But then they have this third category of places to connect and socialise as well. But we know these things are important, but if you can't measure them, you can't manage them. And while cities have increasing amounts of data available about their physical infrastructure, about air quality and traffic and transport, they have very little information about what actually drives social and cultural life. And that's because this kind of information is kind of hard to get. You're either looking at the census, which is 5 years old, it's out of date before it's even released. And when you're making property decisions or even customer-centric decisions around demographics, valuations, etc., neighbourhoods are moving much faster than that. Or you can do surveys, focus groups, observations. I have personally spent many hours of my life standing on a street corner observing people. That is actually how it's done. It's a shame. And while those can be useful in context, we can only do that at point in time. And the challenge with surveys is we can only answer the questions that we thought to ask, not all of these other lifestyle factors that perhaps weren't visible to us. So the city makers' challenge as we see it is that, one, we have lifestyles that are changing really, really fast. And this will be affecting your customers in the same way. We have millennial markets who don't want to buy one house, not that they can even buy it anyway, and live in it and build community over 20 years. They have these very transient lifestyles, likely to have 17 jobs, just as likely to move to New York as they are to Sydney. Now, how do we create neighbourhoods for that kind of experience economy? When we've got evidence base around demographics and data that is static, non-responsive, and only talks to a very slim set of questions that we ask. For the property sector, but also in many other areas, this affects our delivery to provide really effective services and products to service those markets. But the overriding impact of that at a city level is that it's leading to poorer outcomes in what we're actually building because we're not getting our product market fit right. But there are ways that we can use data to start to shift the dial on this conversation. Every time you like, tweet, check in, post, you're showing the world what you value and you're contributing to a digital footprint of a city. We talk about digital twins in terms of having a replica of a city in terms of its building replica. But we actually, in many ways now, have a population-level data set about behaviour and lifestyle through our smartphones and social media accounts. Now, Neighbourlytics harnesses this data, which we call social data, to understand how neighbourhoods are working in real time. We take in data feeds that allow us to do geospatial analysis on trends of where people spend time and behavioural analytics, and then aggregate that around core dimensions of wellbeing, such as economy, physicality, community. Now, a point that I'll raise here, because I've mentioned social media, is that we're not actually talking about any kind of personal information here. We actually don't even access any of the personal data. That it's actually your location and the location information that is the best proxy for that. We look at how busy is the cafe, what are the events happening in the park. It's the place data, not the personal information. And to give you an example of how this can be useful, if you ask me, perhaps in a survey, how often I go to the gym, what am I going to tell you? Lies. I'm going to tell you that I go 5 times a week, which, sometimes I do, right? I'm going to tell you what I want you to think about me and maybe what I do sometimes. It's like, how long does it take to get there? 20 minutes, right? On a Sunday afternoon, no traffic. It could take 20 minutes, maybe. But, on average, it's 45 minutes. So actually, what my location is going to show you is that I go to the gym once a week. And so we actually start to, if we scale up that error across all the different aspects of our lives and all the different dimensions of our population, you can see that some of the data that we rely on to understand customers and demographics is actually very unreliable. So we call social data is data that's created from unconventional digital sources that's indicative of people's behaviour and lifestyle choices. And there's huge amounts of application for this data for the property sector, but also beyond. So we can look at one kind of a neighbourhood and we'll see one kind of activity. We can make assumptions about what kind of place this is. But the digital data will actually reveal it has a social and cultural life, that it has a lot of independent shops, it has home-based businesses, it's got parents groups and walking clubs and other types of activity that's going on that form part of its lifestyle. So we can see neighbourhoods in 2 ways. This is Pyrmont. We can look at its physical neighbourhood, or we can also, as another layer, look at its social and cultural life, which is what you're seeing on your right. Each dot that is represented there is a place that exists in the real world. It's a museum, it's a cafe, it's a bar, it's a park, it's an event. And the size of the bubble relates to how much people engage with that place, which is due to how long they spend there, whether or not they rate and review, like, check in, etc. So we actually get a sense of not only which places are there, but which are the most important. Also, neighbourhoods don't exist at one point in time. They feel different during the day, in the evening, on a weekday, on a weekend, and we can map that temporally and by time of day. And this is part of an analysis looking into Sydney's nighttime economy, of understanding which places are busy during the day, which places are busy during the evening. We can also then understand events and programs through this data, and one of the correlations that we interestingly found that this area of Sydney, which is including Darling Harbour, is actually busier than Barcelona or Brooklyn in New York. There's a lot of events going on there. We can also understand an expression of community values through what people talk about and elect to share. And there's a very interesting psychology now proven around what people choose to share and choose not to share. And it really shows a strengths-based lens around what people want to connect with most in different places. Now, again, we're not looking at the complete set of everything that people post about. What we're looking at is how they engage with a particular place. And we look at thematics around, are people spending time and engaging with public spaces? Is it with arts and culture? Is it with other community organisations? And see very interesting and clear trends through this kind of information. We can look at cities like Singapore. Who's been to Singapore? I'm sure most of you. Been to Gardens by the Bay? Yeah, so this Marina Bay Sands, which you're seeing on the right, Gardens by the Bay, spectacular new precinct, beautiful, designed, adds a lot of value to Singapore, but it has a very different social and cultural life from the perhaps more human scale places like Chinatown. So it has lots of small scale, small businesses, small scale activity, as opposed to Marina Bay Sands, which has large events, large programs, etc. And what that looks like in the digital data is that places like Chinatown have a much, much larger digital footprint. People actually engage and spend much more time there than they do in Marina Bay Sands. Now, the purpose of this study was actually to look at drivers of retail success. So Marina Bay Sands is a large shopping mall there. It has lots of large stores. But what we know about the future of retail is that the most successful places are those which drive experience. So if you want to drive experience, people are often craving that authentic, small-scale, human-scale places. Some of the lessons that we can learn from places like Chinatown, even though they were built many hundreds of years ago. So Neighbourlytics in the past year has captured data like this for more than 500 neighbourhoods in 10 countries around the world, working largely with the property sector, but also governments to understand their social and cultural life patterns. Having this scale of data set now enables us to have a new lens in what actually drives neighbourhoods that work and what is their success factors. And I want to show you a couple of examples of this. This kind of data, this kind of location data is shown to be now 5 times more accurate than demographic information in terms of, and I think that this is an interesting thing, even though I'm talking about property-related projects here, many of your questions around customers, around valuations, around insurance and mortgage risk would rely heavily on demographics. And maybe there are other lifestyle factors that are actually going to turn that on its head and say that people in the same age bracket and socioeconomic bracket don't necessarily behave the same way, don't necessarily have the same risk factors. So 3 ways that social data can really change the way that we use cities. And I'm going to give 3 examples. I want to look at how it influences how we understand customers, how it understands how we influence places and neighbourhoods, and how it influences organisations in terms of how we measure success and KPIs of what we're doing. So firstly, to look at customers. This is about how do we avoid the assumption problem. If we're designing places, retail, assets, others, in an environment where people want experiences rather than stuff, we need to look at behaviour rather than demographics as a predictor of success. We need to be able to look at what the sharing economy is doing rather than ownership. We need to be looking at how do we map and measure where people are likely to buy and spend time in an environment where they're very transient. They're hard to pin down. So let's look at 3 different neighbourhoods and how this can play out. Can anyone tell me the difference between these 3 places? What are some obvious differences to you? It's a trick question because they look almost the same. And they are actually in 3 very different, geographically different areas of Melbourne. Cranbourne, Taylors Hill and Epping. They're all around the same age suburb. But they actually have very different patterns of economic activity and social activity. Now, just to sort of highlight what you're looking at here, Cranbourne on your left, what we're seeing there is quite an interconnected and strong local economy. And it's not just the things that you would see, like the stores. All of those smaller dots there are home-based businesses. They're the informal economy. It's people's side hustle. It's the gig economy. This is showing up. Now, when we look at this doesn't look like a retail precinct. It doesn't look like a business precinct. But in fact, there is a lot of activity going on there that actually reframes how that neighbourhood is being used. And the developer that we were working with in this context is now using this information to reprioritise how they invest in facilities. Where they were running parents groups and building community facilities is now thinking, well, perhaps business meetups, co-working spaces may be more accurate for the type of community that's living there. In Taylors Hill, we see emerging community activity, light green is community, and what we're seeing is really large bubbles there, which means that the new services that have been provided are being really well used and engaged with. There's now a drive to deliver services early, particularly ahead of housing, and that's having huge impact, but some of them aren't working, and some of them are. In this context, they've got really high levels of engagement. And in Epping, what we're starting to see is an emerging main street. We're starting to see sort of centralised activity, multi-use activity along that spine. Now, in urban design, that's a very successful thing because what you actually want to do for successful places is to gravitate the activity around centres. You don't want it to be too spread out. So we have this different kind of local life that's really changing the way that we understand these places and helping to drive different investment decisions. We can also then drill down and actually look at what these places are, which helps us to understand how diverse they are, the types of stakeholders that we might want to engage with, and the types of activities that are going on, or to see how people crowdsource information about their own neighbourhood, what's important to these places. And we can see in Cranbourne an emerging conversation around family and pets and home life, while in Taylors Hill, the time that this data was collected was around an event that was with a lot of activities and hobbies, so that's that really large bar there. And in Epping, we see it's interestingly much more around creative activities and socialising in events than it is around sort of home life and pets. So there's these different kind of trends that emerge, and this data can be collected monthly, quarterly, in real time to start to demonstrate what some of these trends are. The second thing is we can use this information to understand the identity of precincts and neighbourhoods in that way. If we can understand who's living in a community and how it really works, it really changes the way that we prioritise services for them. If we understand how places function, it helps to drive what kinds of investment decisions we would make or what kind of optimisation we might do. Now, our traditional ways of understanding places are through things like suburbs, but people's behaviour doesn't really necessarily recognise this invisible line that I'm in one postcode here and I'm in another postcode there. They actually just go to what's closest to them. And this was a project that we worked on in Parkville, which is joining 5 different suburbs. And so the demographic and retail information for this neighbourhood is really skewed by what's happening right over the other side in Carlton, because that's forming the same suburb boundary. But people there, they shop in Moonee Ponds. Like, they don't really affect Parkville. So it really changes this way. So instead of looking at that, for larger assets such as shopping centres, what we've been looking at is trade area analysis, where you can actually take the behavioural data at a city scale, so this is for Cairns, and then we can look at where the centres are and reprioritise what the actual lived experience of that neighbourhood is based on the social data. And this really changes the way that we understand the footprint of these neighbourhoods. It affects what kinds of retail curation you might put there, what kind of programs and events you might run, based on understanding what are the dominant lifestyle behaviours for these neighbourhoods. A second example of this is looking at a diagnostic framework. So how do we compare neighbourhoods to understand different drivers? So if the first was looking at in retail context, another big question that the property sector is asking at the moment is how do we drive employment and job growth? How do we use cities as a catalyst for employment and job growth? And what we know that there are certain districts in the world that have done it successfully, that in the last 10 years they've created 10,000 or more jobs, largely catalysed through large-scale urban renewal projects. Projects like Barangaroo, like Fisherman's Bend in Melbourne. And what can we learn from these other precincts? So we can actually do like kind of a competitor or comparison analysis to look at these success factors. So by comparing these kinds of neighbourhoods like Vancouver's Falls Creek, like Portland's Pearl District, like Barcelona's 22 At District, we can actually understand are there correlations and trends between these places that help us understand how we might want to reprioritise our investment locally. Now you can see that the behavioural patterns of these cities are all very different. The small-scale grid structure in Buenos Aires. Auckland is, in fact, the busiest of all these precincts. Auckland's Wynyard District, curiously, has the most kind of events and activities going on. Well, you can see that they all have lots of places there, but also 60% of the reason why people would come to these kinds of districts is for destinations. Now, a destination is something that we describe as a place that attracts people. It's bar and dining, it's cafes, it's perhaps events in public spaces, for example. So that what we can tell from this data is that the neighbourhoods that have really been successful in job creation have been the ones that focused most on not the job creation, but livability. Now, of course, cafes employ people, etc., events employ people. But what we're seeing is actually quite a small proportion of places that list themselves as professional services, as industries, and we're seeing a very large proportion of places that list themselves as all of the other places, the kind of the social glue that knits places together. And so this is a lesson that we can learn. It's actually very consistent with a lot of social research done around innovation districts, that what we want to do to drive job growth is we want to attract the talent. To attract the talent, we need to have really great livable neighbourhoods, and these are the types of places that those kinds of livable neighbourhoods have. Final example is looking at this at the city scale and how we can use this kind of information to understand return on investment or other risk factors. So when we're looking at neighbourhoods, and we've been working in Darwin, one of the really important things is to have dynamic data. So Darwin has received a city deal. Part of that city deal is looking at how do we improve the infrastructure to increase active lifestyles. Really hard to get out and about in the hot season in Darwin. Has anyone been to Darwin recently or from Darwin? It's quite nice in the cool season, but really you can't even go outside, it's so hot. And so how do you increase people's health through things like walking, cycling, being outdoors in that kind of environment? So part of their investment is in shade, it's in cooling, it's in making a city that's more compact, more walkable. But to be able to ensure that that investment actually results in the kinds of behavioural outcomes that they're expecting to, they need to measure it differently because they need to measure it seasonally and in real time. So by looking at this kind of information across the whole city, we've done a baseline, and we're using this as a KPI for the city to be able to measure what their return is on that investment that they're making in infrastructure on the other net community gain. So we see really interesting things about Darwin. It's a super interesting, unique place. And I just want to point out one thing, that everything below the airport there, that's the airport in the middle, is the places that you would expect to be busy. It's the CBD, it's the industrial district, it's the employment areas. Everything north, that's very sleepy suburbs. So why is there so much activity going on there? It's informal community events, it's home-based businesses again. These neighbourhoods are not always what they seem, and it's really interesting. For me, anyway. We can then look at these in terms of a community strength map. And we're now starting to talk to some of the larger financial institutions about how this kind of information can be brought into both valuations, but also critically, insurance risk factors. How well would Darwin bounce back from another cyclone? Now, one of the biggest predictors of how fast it will bounce back is its community strength. If we can map that in real time, then we have a different lens for how we understand places and understand those risk factors. We can also compare neighbourhood on neighbourhood, the different ways that they compare to each other, as a diagnosis of where to start improvements. We can make assumptions that a place needs a new library, a place needs a new school, when it might actually be the local park that's the thing that's neglected, and everyone loves the library even though it's not new and fancy in that way. So this kind of suburb-based information and city-scale information is now being used by city governments as a KPI as well as a project level. So coming back to data, there are so many different ways that we can think about new forms of data that are being used and generated. And in fact, 90% of the data available today was created in just the last 2 years, which means I think we are only just beginning to see the type of information that we have available to improve our services, to improve our cities and neighbourhoods. If we can even look at this, places like Nairobi, where in stores like this, you pay on your phone, that we have a very much working towards a data-led future. But that data-led future needs to come back to the question of why. That cities are not necessarily about parking efficiency and building heights. The things that we love and connect with the most are the social and cultural life. That what drives our health, our well-being, and our outlook. And that's where social data can be so useful. And I think we've got time for some questions, but I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Fascinating stuff. That was great, Lucinda. Thank you. I loved your point that our location data 5 times more accurate than demographic data.
Yeah.
My favourite one on that is that when they're trying to track the progress of disease, you've probably heard this one,
yes.
that if you can go, if there's a flu outbreak, you can ask the official medical body of a country, where's it at, what's going on. You can go to hospitals and doctors and or...
you can ask a phone company.
Yeah, or Google, with Google searches for flu symptoms and flu medication, accurately predict the spread of flu far faster than any official. I love it. A lot of your stuff centres on property. What can banking learn directly and indirectly from the sort of stuff you're talking about? You touched on a little bit. Go a bit deeper.
Sure. I mean, what I am fascinated by with the financial sector and banking more generally is that you actually have a huge physical footprint nationally. Whether it's through branches in local neighbourhoods, some of which are doing well, some of which aren't, because that whole system around branches is being turned on its head in the new economy. But what can those assets and facilities be used for now that they have been these kind of anchors of local neighbourhoods for so long, and that's really changing. So understanding those behavioural and lifestyle characteristics can change the way that we think about that kind of physical geographic footprint. But equally, I come back to the question around, human-centred services. If we're trying to create human-centred cities for people, you're trying to do the same thing. It's human-centred services. But how those services are delivered will be so different geographically because the interests, behaviour and lifestyle characteristics of people and what they need to be supported in different geographic regions will be very different. So that can also sort of reframe how we create a more human-centred service, because human-centred design requires having data about people, funnily enough. And then the emerging conversation that we're now having with some of the larger financial institutions is around different ways of reframing risk factors and looking at community risk factors. And that's something that we'd like to explore further if there's anyone who's keen to provide us with any feedback on that.
Okay, for your last question, let me tie together 4 questions. One I plan to ask, 3 that came up in the app that I think distill down to 2 questions.
Okay, we'll be fast.
Multiple people asked, where did you source the data from? Some specifically asked, was it Google, Facebook?
Yep.
Where did you source it from? And secondly, how representative is it? A couple of people asked, are certain people extroverts who post more overrepresented? What about older people who might not be on Snapchat, etc.? So where do you get it from, and how confident are you in the truly representative nature of your data?
It's a very good question, and one that comes up a lot for us, so thank you for asking that. In terms of the data sources, it comes from any kind of digital source that's reflective of behaviour and lifestyle. So we have a licensing agreement with Google and Facebook. They're very rich sources of information, but we also look at Twitter, Instagram, Zomato, Yelp, TripAdvisor, Eventbrite, Event Finder, and we're adding more all the time as they come online. What we're trying to create is a multi-layered picture so that we can triangulate. If a place says it's a cafe on Google, does it also say it's a cafe on Facebook? Do people also rate and review it as a place? So we can verify that it exists as that kind of use, for example. The question about the digital divide and representation is a really interesting one, and what we've seen in the last 5 years is a real shift. So where perhaps I'm not saying the digital divide doesn't exist, it does, but it doesn't exist in terms of smartphone use. So 80% of homeless people have a smartphone. People's smartphone use doesn't distinguish now socioeconomically. In fact, people who are from lower SES categories tend to actually prioritise phone use over other essentials like rent, for example. And so where in a survey we tend to have a huge bias towards people who speak English, who want to do a survey, who are literate, who have a certain level of education, we don't have that kind of bias in digital data because people of all demographics are generating data all the time. Now, there are some demographics, and I'll just be very quick on this, but it's just a complicated question to explain.
No, go for it. I think it's really interesting.
Like children under 10, like very old people, people who are unwell, who we would expect are not represented in that data. But where we can pick up information, because we're looking for behaviour and lifestyle indicators, we can pick up information through the carer information. So parents post about their kids quite a lot, turns out. Similarly,
have you seen? I've got one. Sorry.
So if our question was how child-friendly or how engaged are children with this neighbourhood, we can pick up a lot of that information through the carer data, and it shows up similarly with people who might be caring for older citizens, for example, that we can see those patterns. So there are certainly, lots of digital divides around, say, broadband access, laptop use, education that absolutely exist, but in terms of smartphone and social media use, that gap is largely closed, and we pick up about 90% of the population, and the 10% that's missing is a random sample. It's not one demographic.
Fantastic. Give her a massive round of applause. Thank you so much. That was great, Lucinda.